So next up when we talk about administration is the administration of the facilities that you work in. So you are not just a patient care provider. You are usually also a caretaker of a facility that you work in. Um, and it's a huge part of being an athletic trainer, being any healthcare provider, is making sure that your facility is safe and you know, the most optimal environment for your patients. So you want to make sure your facilities are free of potential hazards, and that they're conducive to patient care. So can you do what you need to do without running into things or people or things like that? You also want to make sure that you are following all federal regulations and state regulations, so state building codes and things like that, but also federal regulations like the American with Disabilities Act. So is your space handicap accessible? Do you have what you need to work with individuals of various physical, mental backgrounds, and how you can assist them? There are regulation boards that are responsible for making sure that healthcare facilities are safe. One of the most common is what's known as the Joint Commission. Also, state regulatory boards are responsible for this. Joint Commission is usually clinics and hospitals. Few athletic training facilities in schools have an external accreditor like this, but that doesn't mean there aren't standards that they need to follow. And again, OSHA plays a role in this too, of making sure you have a safe environment. The ADA plays a role. There's lots of regulations within the college that you'd probably have to follow. So there's always something that's kind of dictating what your facility is and how it functions. And usually that involves annual inspections or spot inspections to make sure that you follow all of the codes. So specifically in an athletics training facility, and specifically kind of thinking around our idea of modalities, we have a couple areas of interest that specifically have a lot of kind of legal issues around them. So the first one is the electrical system within the facility. If you're going to have modalities, and especially hydrotherapy modalities, it's really important that you have the proper electrical system to make sure people stay safe. So most modalities, like E-stim, ultrasound, the light therapy, things like that, usually use 110 volt typical voltage for an outlet, or they're potentially even on batteries or something like that. Larger equipment, things like isokinetic machines, potentially some of your Whirlpool stuff, things like that, are going to be 220 volts. So you're going to have a special outlet that you'll need to hook those up. And dedicated currents usually, because they'll blow a current if you have too many things on that current. So they usually only have one outlet for that type of device. Another big kind of issue that we have to be concerned about with modalities, and again especially with water around, is what we call ground fault interrupters, or GFIs. So if there's water and electricity near each other, a GFI is required. And you've maybe even noticed this in your own life. So in your bathroom, you usually have a little button on your outlets that say reset or kind of clear or something like that. Those are GFIs. And what they do is they close the amperage, they close the circuit much faster than a circuit breaker would. So your normal circuit breaker in your house will trip and end up kind of opening if a certain voltage or current, amperage I should say, crosses it from like a surge. The GFI does that, but just for that outlet and at a much smaller, like we're talking like 0.05 milliamps, much smaller current surge. And so it's there to protect you if you're in a situation that is potentially a little more dangerous, like water and electricity. GFIs are also recommended in all of the patient care areas. That's really important. So it's not required like it is with water, but it's recommended in patient care areas. Those outlets need to be 2 to 3 feet above the ground, okay, in just typical areas. And then if you're in a hydrotherapy area, they should actually be 4 feet above the ground, so that if there's water on the ground, it doesn't affect the outlet. And then it should also be out of the reach of patients. So if the patients are sitting in the hydro tub, they shouldn't be able to reach the outlet and pull out the plug or do things like that. Another part of the electrical system to be aware of is surge protectors. And that's for any of your machinery that has a microprocessor. So that's essentially a computer, right? So our eSTIM or ultrasounds, all those should really be on surge protectors to, again, just protect your investment. And especially when we have a patient hooked up, just think especially with eSTIM when we're talking about putting an electrical current into someone, we want that machine to get shut down if there's some sort of surge. And so the surge protector helps with that as well, as will the GFI. Really, you just need to make sure you're following your health and your building codes and making sure that it's the most safe environment possible electrically. Another area, the treatment area, we have some kind of standards you want to think about. Your biggest thing with your treatment area is you want to be able to maneuver and work with your patient in kind of the safest environment possible. So usually that involves the table placement and the type of tables. So ideally, treatment tables are about 30 inches high. So, you know, they're there for us to be able to kind of stand around and be able to look at the individual. Ideally, adjustable tables are best. That's kind of, again, not required, but it's an OSHA recommendation, because then people of all height can get the table to where they need it to be. It also helps for an individual who maybe has a disability or something to get up on the table, and then we can raise it up to where we need it to be. You want to make sure your tables meet ADA approval. If you're going to do a lot of treatments for elevation and things like that, a split leg where we can actually elevate part of the table is really nice for that. If you're going to have shortwave diathermy in your facility, they recommend all wood tables versus metal tables. Shortwave diathermy uses electrical magnetic currents, and so sometimes having too much metal in the area can kind of mess with that system. Ideally, you want 30 inches apart, but that's the minimum. Ideally, you want even more space, because you've all been downstairs when it's tight and you have multiple people and you have two clinicians trying to work on either side of a table, and you're trying to do range of motion exercises or, you know, stretch someone out, and it's crowded. So ideally, more space is recommended. Also, within the treatment area, you want good lighting, because if we're going to be evaluating things, we need to be able to see. We want our patients to be able to see. So we measure lighting in what's called foot candles. It goes back to the day of like how much light a candle would give off, so how many feet you could see. Well, for lighting in the treatment area, we ideally want something between 50 and 70 foot candles at a height of 4 feet above the floor. So if you measured that 4 feet above the floor, which would kind of be typical height that a patient would be sitting at or something, you know, where we'd be doing most of our work, 50 to 70 foot candles. In other areas, offices, hydro area, things like that, it can be a little bit less, and that can be about 30 to 50. Now the hydro area, we mentioned this a little bit with the electrical system already, but your hydro area, and you really want separate from the rest of your space, because you want to be able to create an environment that's going to respond well for water. So you have usually your whirlpools in there. You might have like swim tanks or like underwater treadmills or things like that. You're going to have your ice machines, hot and cold water supply, or a mixing valve for being able to make the whirlpools the temperature you want them to be. Your sinks are usually back there, refrigerators, freezers, the on-off for the whirlpools, all of that wants to be contained and be safe. So we want to make sure those on-off switches for whirlpools can't be reached by the patient when they're in their tub. And we'll talk more about that when we start talking about heat and cold. You want signs posted about safety. You want it to be in full view. So there's a reason we have glass on that wall. You want to be able to see people in the tub from anywhere in the space. Ideally, ours is not a really great setup right now anyways, because the staff, when they're sitting in their offices, can't really see the tubs. So you'd want to be in an environment where really you can always see that. It is noisy. So usually people glass in the hydro area to kind of reduce that noise. When people, the machines put off a lot of noise. If you're using whirlpools that have turbines, that puts off a lot of noise. There's also usually a lot of humidity. So you want good humidity control, because The last thing we want is a warm, kind of moist, dark environment where fungus and bacteria and viruses can grow. So ideally good air conditioning, keeping the humidity at about 40 to 50%, and that the air can be recycled about 8 to 10 times per hour. You want temp gauges on all your whirlpools, all your tubs, and you want to make sure, again, that you have the ability to control the hot and cold either through mixing valves or through separate controls. You want to make sure all your equipment gets calibrated, that you have GFIs, that your electrical system gets looked at. You want a non-slip surface. Again, things get wet. You want that to slope to a drain. And you want to be able to really easily clean and access all the equipment around the whirlpool so that you can clean it effectively. So when you're creating your space, you're obviously going to have equipment, and we talk modalities, that there's a lot of equipment. It's your responsibility as a clinician and as someone using this equipment that you maintain it. And so you need regular inspections and professional calibrations. So good maintenance requires those regular inspections to look for defects, any hazards that might occur. The machine usually needs periodic cleaning. Dust can get in, especially again those ones where it has a microprocessor like a computer. Dust can get in through the vents and so on. And so you want to do your professional calibration in line with whatever the manufacturer recommends. So if that's annually, semi-annually, annually is usually the upper limit, right? Like you shouldn't go longer than a year without having everything inspected. Electrical operated modalities like E-stim, ultrasound, shortwave diathermy, again, need to be checked yearly or ideally semi-annually. You need a qualified service technician to do that. The date of the inspections should be documented, not only in files, but on the unit itself. So you'll notice little stickers on our units telling us when the inspections have occurred and what work was done. So was there a need for a repair or was everything fine? All that should be recorded. If a defect is found in the plug or the cord, or if the GFI continues to trip, or something in the unit doesn't function properly, you don't want to keep using that, right? You're using that on a patient. So you want to unplug it, label it as being, broken or inoperable, and then get it out of the treatment area so that it doesn't accidentally get used, and either send it in for service or have someone come out and service it. The final piece that kind of goes around facilities is that every facility should have a really good working policy and procedure manual. And this policy and procedure manual is a very extensive document that lists out the facility's scope of service, so who are their patients, what do they do, who all works there, any operational plans, any standard operating procedures, any kind of typical standards that need to be followed, so like emergency action plans are usually included, how you are compliant with federal guidelines, so OSHA compliance for bloodborne pathogen as well as for all the things with OSHA, FDA compliance, State Pharmacy Board compliance, State Practice Act compliance, how all those things are being handled in your facility need to be documented in your policy and procedure manual. It also goes into job descriptions for your employees, so defining their roles, their responsibilities, kind of the minimum expectation of the employees. There's usually also an organizational chart that describes the relationship between all the individuals, who reports to who is delivering services, what patients are involved with which individuals. If you are supervising students, there's usually sections on that. How you're going to document, what is your policy on documentation, how do you order, how do you budget. All of these things get included in the policy and procedure manual. And actually your senior year, your class as a whole will be responsible for creating a policy and procedure manual. So it's a good idea to become familiar with these things because they are essentially again, what's going to be called upon in legal issues. They also lay out your job, and really just make sure that you're in compliance with any state or federal regulations.